Welcome everyone to this episode of Keto Chat. I am your guide, your host, your tour guide. I'm thinking of the cruise ship. Tom, you remember back from the Love Boat? Julie.
That's going back a ways. Yeah.
That's what this coming to mind today. So I'm Carol Freeman, your cruise director for this episode. Certified nutritionist and creator of the Fast Track to Keto Success program. I am here today. Dr. Fabian, Tom and I had such a great conversation last time. We were doing not a repeat, but a follow-up discussion. So Tom Fabian, PhD, CNTP, is a functional health expert and former research scientist. He specializes in the areas of healthy aging, metabolic regulation, and gut immune brain dysfunction. He provides educational programs and resources for practitioners on the gut microbiome via his website, Microbiome Mastery. So welcome back, Tom. I'm so excited to have you here. So we're going to focus today on ketogenic diet and brain function and neurodegenerative diseases as we age and how the microbiome and gut-brain axis play into that. So I bet you lost sleep and couldn't wait to talk about this today.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics.
Excellent.
So thanks so much for allowing me to be here today. It's been great and enjoyed the last time.
Yeah.
And looking forward to where the conversation takes us today.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm going to pause because my neighbors decided to mow their lawn right now. So I'm going to close my window and so that we don't get this. I have no idea if it's coming through my microphone, but we'll minimize the extra sound that we have going on here. So, all right. Well, just to start out with, do ketones help protect? Well, actually, before I dive into some questions we've got, can you just kind of talk about the process of the brain aging, like what happens as we get older in our brain, and what's normal and what's a sign of dysfunction?
Yeah. So there's actually some kind of ongoing debate about that to some extent in terms of what actually is normal, because a lot of pathologies are sort of happening at the same time in various individuals. So it's a little bit hard sometimes to get a take on sort of what's normal. But by most measures, we know that over time, we tend to lose neurons as we age, and that starts apparently pretty early. And depending on all kinds of factors, including sort of how much we've sort of stimulated our brain through learning, et cetera, we may lose connections as well. And I know there's some studies that basically show that higher levels of education correlate with more connections and better brain function throughout lifespan, things like that. But we know that in general, of course, certain functions start to decrease as we age as well. But again, there's debate over, how much of that is normal aging versus precursors to disease, like, decrease in memory, for example, is kind of a common one. And just other aspects of cognitive function, like just processing speed, et cetera. So in general, we know there's just a decrease in function. And then there's also some things at the cellular level that we know are changing as well, related to damage. So aging basically involves, it's kind of this constellation of processes that happen throughout the lifespan that cause damage and dysfunction. So it can be damage to DNA, it can be oxidative stress and inflammation. So those are some of the most common ones, and also including the cell loss that I mentioned, or even just decreased cell function. So those are sort of the basic aspects of aging in general, and some things related to brain aging. So that's, but, again, there's really a lot of debate because there are studies showing that people even into their 90s, the luckier ones, or who happen to maintain a better lifestyle or have better genetics, or all of the above, that they have relatively little decrease in their brain function up until pretty advanced ages, whereas certain people, even in their 50s and 60s, can have pretty significant decrease in function, and that can be due to a lot of different factors. One of the things I'll just mention as a side note, there was a study just published recently about a gene that was discovered, a gene variation, where this gene has a pretty significant impact on normal brain aging. So it's not a risk factor for like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. It's basically just involved in normal brain aging, which happens to some extent independently of these diseases.
Okay.
There's crosstalk, but there's also sort of an independent, just basic brain aging process. Of course, I looked mine up, and it turns out I have the bad version of it, unfortunately.
Oh.
But to me, that adds more motivation to continue to do all the right things.
What's the gene name? I want to look mine up later too. What's the?
It's a pretty long name. I'll have to send it to you, but it begins with so the first part is TMEM, and then there's a long string of numbers and characters. So I don't remember the details, but it turns out that it's particularly involved in aging of the forebrain. So it's really involved in only one part of the brain. And it really mostly has an effect on the balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory factors. So again, this implicates inflammation and neuroinflammation as a major factor. Not only we already know that that's linked to neurodegenerative diseases, but now we know that that's linked to brain aging as well. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of focus on today, is particularly in relation to ketogenic diet and ketones, and also the gut-brain axis. All of those are related to inflammation and ways that we can reduce inflammation. And so that's really a key aspect, I think, of helping to protect the brain as we age, because we know this process is going to happen, but we do have control over how fast it's going to happen. And we can maintain, these examples of people in their 90s that have really good brain function, I think is a shining example of what is possible if we do all these things to help maintain our brain function.
Yeah, well, and when you send me that gene, we'll put it in the show notes down below so that other people, because they're probably curious as well. I did my 23andMe genetic testing a couple of months ago, and so I'm curious to see what version of it I have now too. So
exactly, yeah. So I'll make a note here to make sure I send that to you when we're done.
Okay, great. Well, so where do you want to go first, or is it a logical step from ketones on the brain or the gut microbiome? Like, where do you want to take this first?
So why don't we talk a little bit about ketogenesis, ketogenic diet, and just sort of different ways to increase your ketone production. So maybe back up a minute, and we'll talk about why that can be important for brain function. And certainly chime in, because I know you've done a lot of research and working with clients in this area as well. I'd love to hear your clinical perspective on all of this. But we know that there's pretty strong evidence, of course, with regard to epilepsy that ketogenic diet, of course, is therapeutic. But over time, we've also found that ketogenic diet and other approaches to raising ketones can also be protective in other neurodegenerative diseases. And over the last 10, 15 years, there's now some research and even clinical research that suggests that ketones can help with the symptoms of Alzheimer's. It's not really shown to be any sort of cure for Alzheimer's, but certainly can help because part of the dysfunction in Alzheimer's is the decrease in the ability of these brain cells to utilize glucose as a fuel. And of course, our brains are energy hogs, and they need a lot of energy. And if they're not getting enough from glucose, but they don't have any other source, then they're going to suffer in terms of their function. So the ketogenic diet and supplying ketones in other ways can help overcome that deficit, at least to some extent. So these studies, because it's difficult for some people to really go kind of full bore ketogenic. And there are ways, I'm sure, to make that somewhat easier. But people have been looking for alternatives to do that. And so one of the main ways is just to supply sources for ketones in the diet, like MCT oil, or medium chain triglyceride oil, which is related to coconut oil. And also even forms of ketones that you can take in through the diet or supplements, which are known as ketone esters. And so those studies, both in animals and even some clinical trials, seem to show an improvement in people. So they've looked at this further, and there's really two main ketones that are produced in the body. There's actually three, but one of them is really dissipated pretty rapidly. And that's acetone, which we tend to breathe out. So it's not as relevant. But one of the ketones, called beta hydroxybutyrate, really has a lot of good research around it in terms of its beneficial effects. And there was a major research paper that came out a few years ago showing that it serves as a major antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. and it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. And they've even found, so sort of historically, they thought mostly that ketones were produced by the liver, but recent research suggests that ketones can even be produced by astrocytes in the brain.
Ooh, cool.
Which is a pretty strategic thing for the brain when it really needs its fuel to have the cells that are right next to the neurons.
So is it making the brain making those from fatty acids?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was a pretty interesting thing I'd never heard of until recently. It's not really all that well established yet, but there's growing research that I would say by now pretty much shows that astrocytes, do have a supportive role as far as that goes and are an important source for brain ketones. But this beta hydroxybutyrate really, they know by now after studying it so much that there's really several different ways in which it helps brain cells, particularly in related to aging and neurodegenerative diseases. And that's number one, by providing an extra energy source. So when glucose is low, obviously when we're fasting, for example, or we're doing super low carb ketogenic diet, we don't have the carbs around to make a lot of glucose from. So we need an alternative source for the brain. And so that's what the ketones provide, especially beta hydroxybutyrate. So that's one of the main ways that it functions. Another way is by reducing the production of these free radicals, or reactive oxygen species is another term for them. So those cause damage to cell components. And beta hydroxybutyrate not only reduces those, just because of the way that it's burned in the mitochondria, it's kind of a cleaner burning fuel, so to speak, than glucose is in some ways. But it also acts as a signal to the body that it's under stress. Because historically, sort of evolutionarily, ketones were produced primarily in response to vigorous exercise as well as fasting. And basically, fasting wasn't so much a choice back then. We had to go for periods without food. That's a stress to the body. So this is an adaptive. So basically, it signals the body to turn on these protective genes, including antioxidant genes. So it's really helping to reduce the oxidative stress especially in neurons, which are particularly susceptible to oxidative stress. So that's a really important factor in terms of how beta hydroxybutyrate functions. It's also known to be a pretty potent anti-inflammatory, and also increases something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is really important for kind of maintaining those connections in the brain. So it really has this multifaceted, set of benefits that really are beneficial, I think, overall for the brain. And the idea with regard to aging and protection from neurodegeneration is even periods of ketogenesis, whether it's periodic fasting, whether it's intensive exercise, or going on a ketogenic diet periodically, that's going to help reduce some of this oxidative stress damage to the neurons. And that's significant. And it's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily necessary in a lot of cases to go full ketogenic all the time. And there's some debate, which I'd love to talk to you more about, hopefully in this discussion, about doing sort of ketogenic diet periodically, or maybe most of the time, but not necessarily all the time, versus doing it just all the time. I don't think the research really has resolved that debate, but it's kind of an interesting kind of thing to think about. So that's really what I wanted to say about just ketones, ketogenic diet in general, in terms of the brain. Is so far there's a lot of promising research suggesting these ketones can really be beneficial.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if we can kind of talk about the difference, or just briefly kind of define the difference between just age-related dementia and Alzheimer's. I remember from school learning about, there's a couple different kinds of dementia. Let's see, like vascular, and then there's another one, I think. And then Alzheimer's, are they all the same thing? Or how are they different, and what different age-related brain disease might we be watching out for?
Well, so that's a good question. And I first have to sort of issue my disclaimer that I'm not a specialist in Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases. It's an area that I tend to focus on in terms of more brain aging in general.
Okay.
But I do know that there are different types of dementia. And you mentioned, vascular versus Alzheimer's, et cetera. And even within Alzheimer's, there's subtypes. If you follow Dale Bredesen's research, he talks about, I think, 3 or 4 different subtypes of Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And I don't remember offhand all the different subtypes, but they have to do with sort of the underlying pathology in terms of what's going on. So it's sort of like a lot of things now that we used to label them, with one term and think they were one thing.
Okay.
Now we're realizing it's sort of this spectrum of syndrome, sort of like autism spectrum.
Yeah. Okay.
It really depends on what the underlying causes are in that case. And that's really what I focus on, is sort of how do we address these imbalances, especially early on, to really focus on supporting the brain as we age.
Nice. And there was something you said when you started talking about that, about how, using if people don't want to do a full ketogenic diet, using support, exogenous sources of ketones or things that are quickly converted to ketones in our body, such as MCT oil, coconut oil, and then the exogenous ketones. There is a research and a very structured way of doing a ketogenic type diet, an MCT oil one that they've done with epilepsy, where you can have a higher carb intake and then supplement with enough MCT oil to kind of overcome a normal carb, not a normal carb intake, but a high enough level of carbs that normally would keep somebody from getting into ketosis. And so we have that, research that shows that can be just as effective for preventing seizures for epilepsy as a full regular, therapeutic ketogenic diet. My concern, though, is the people that want to just maintain their really high carb, sugar, refined foods diet and not really make much change, and then add coconut oil MCT on top of it, thinking that, well, that's all I have to do. Kind of like, if I have high blood pressure, I'll just take a pill and then I'm fine. And so I'm more concerned too that we don't know what happens when you have high carb, high blood sugar problems, and you're adding ketones on top of that. I feel like that might be for even worse health than just sticking with the standard American diet. What are your thoughts about that?
I think we're on the exact same page. I mean, studies do seem to show that, in these clinical studies where they did use MCT oil and things like that clinically on Alzheimer's patients to see if there was an improvement. Based on the measures that they looked at, cognitive function and things like that, they did detect sort of, most studies are done short term. So these are always short term. Mm-hmm. They did show that there was an improvement in cognitive function. But again, they're looking very narrowly and not really looking overall at their metabolic function, especially long term. So my concerns really are the same as yours, as far as kind of doing these sort of cheating sort of ways, or trying to get the quick results and not have to go the full bore.
Yeah.
And I think my concerns mostly come out of I like to take the ancestral sort of paleo approach for a lot of things, and to put that in perspective, because when you think about how our system evolved, how our body evolved to deal with these things, when the circumstances under which it sort of naturally goes into ketogenesis is fasting and intense exercise. And maybe in certain cultures, in certain regions where they had a super high fat diet, that probably wasn't all that common, based on a lot of studies that have come across for hunter-gatherers, that there weren't very many that would have eaten like literally a ketogenic diet itself. So even that, I have a little bit of less concern, but a little bit of concern over kind of long-term ketogenic diet, just because, again, it's not necessarily what our bodies are fully adapted for, versus fasting and intense exercise is kind of a more sort of evolutionary common scenario. Mm-hmm. But yeah, definitely when we're trying to do the quick way to trick our bodies into doing things, I think that we may be triggering something that's, unintended. Yeah,
we don't have that. That's exactly what my thoughts on that is, that we've never had a natural state of being where we're going to have a high carb intake and ketones circulating in the body and the brain at the same time. And so who knows what's going to happen? That's just an experimentation. And I have seen, people recommending exogenous ketones, for example, as a way of bouncing back after a cheat. And so, you can have this high sugar thing and then just drink these exogenous ketones and you're right back in ketosis, as if like it's an eraser that erases that, assault that you made on your own body. And it doesn't work that way.
Right.
I'm concerned about people using it that way too. We're in a time where we're, this uncontrolled experiment of these being available to anybody because of the supplement laws in the United States. And there really hasn't been research on, using these to overcome cheating and then trying to maintain a high sugar diet or just not make any dietary changes at the same time. So,
right.
Let's see. Okay, so let's go on then to, we talked about how the ketones can help the brain, several different mechanisms for protecting, and also, what I know too is it's able to heal stuff, right? Like it's able to, because you're promoting, autophagy and things like that, you're actually not only protecting the brain and providing a good environment for optimal health, but you're able to kind of repair some of that. Is that what you're seeing in the research too?
Yeah. And again, I think that since ketones are sort of historically produced under fasting conditions,
mm-hmm.
and there have been a series of really fascinating research articles that have come out in the last few years on, you may have heard of the term fasting mimicking diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a diet or fast that lasts about 3 to 5 days, where a very low number of calories are given. So it's not totally fasting. The idea is to kind of make fasting a little bit more palatable, a little bit more tolerable. But the idea is from these studies, and mostly they've been done in animals, and I think there have actually been a couple of small sort of pilot clinical trials done to date, but they do have a significant regenerative effect. And so I don't know if that's really been linked specifically to the ketones themselves, but during that process, we know that key pathways that are protective, they're referred to as stress resistance pathways, are upregulated. And so it has been shown that beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the ketones, is directly involved in those signaling pathways. And a really interesting connection, there's actually quite a few different connections, and I don't think I can remember them all right now just because of all the biochemical complexity, but there's a lot of interest also in something called NAD these days.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's a really key component, not only to sort of metabolism in general, but it's a key signaling molecule. So NAD tends to go high under conditions of fasting. And so basically that's a key trigger for a lot of these stress resistance pathways. And so we know that there's even supplements as well as some pharmaceuticals that are being explored to increase NAD levels.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those have really promising research behind them in terms of impacting potentially aging itself as well as different types of aging-related diseases. And we know that beta-hydroxybutyrate, when its levels increase, that results in increases in NAD. And so it's triggering, we know this sort of molecular pathway, specifically how it's triggering these, they're sort of referred to both as stress resistance pathways and even pro-longevity pathways. Because in experimental animals, when you increase the activity of these pathways or alter these pathways in certain ways, it can lead to longevity. And so this is another interesting link, I think, back to not just sort of focusing on beta-hydroxybutyrate, but also just thinking about the ketogenic diet itself and why it works in a lot of ways. Because the two main pro-longevity pathways, which are also known as stress resistance pathways, are basically the insulin IGF pathway, and IGF stands for insulin-like growth factor, which is related to insulin in some ways. And so that pathway is promoted by carbohydrates. Then there's the mTOR pathway that's promoted by amino acids from proteins. And so basically when the activity levels are high, that's puts the body in sort of an anabolic state. which is good kind of short-term, good during development, things like that. But over the long run, for aging, they've shown that low activity of those two pathways promotes longevity. And so to get low activity, you need low carb and you need low protein. So you've probably heard of caloric restriction.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenon that's been known for like 80 years, where scientists would restrict the calories by like 30% in lab rodents, rats and mice, and they live up to, I think, 30-40% longer in some cases. So pretty significant. And for a long time, they just assumed it was the calories that somehow that's maybe slowed down metabolism, slowed down damage. It turns out that the story is totally different now, and that they've isolated most of those effects to, number one, to the protein pathway. So it's really important to get the effects in those lab animals that protein has to be below a certain point. Can't be too low because that would be detrimental as well. So it's kind of a narrow window, but also low carb. So you think about, well, if both of those pathways need to be lowish in order to promote longevity, what does that leave in terms of macronutrients, right? That leaves fat.
Yes. And alcohol. No, I'm just kidding.
I don't know if I've seen too many studies on the pro-longevity effects of alcohol, except for red wine, maybe.
And even then, it's questionable if that's just wine industry funding or not. But yeah.
Yeah, although it could be due to, there's a lot of good studies on resveratrol and
and the polyphenols as well. If you can separate those out, it's not.
Yeah.
Probably not the alcohol, but yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry, that was just a.
So I think there's, from my background, so when I was in research, we studied aging. That was kind of my general field, genetics of aging. And this is back in the 90s when they were just starting to uncover these pathways. And it's been really fascinating since I'm no longer in research to see how that research has continued to progress. And kind of connecting these dots that, I heard about the ketogenic diet and all these benefits, and I knew all about this sort of research in aging, and hadn't really connected those dots until I looked into it further. And now there's a lot of research that's been coming out showing that there's a lot of intersection there. And it makes sense that if these two pathways that influence aging require low carb and low protein to some extent, that's low carb and or ketogenic type diet. So there's still kind of an ongoing debate about whether a ketogenic diet is really something that should be advocated for those that are interested in, kind of slowing aging or whatever you want to call it, increasing their chances of longevity. But I think there's some research behind it to suggest that may be a way to go.
Yeah. What are your thoughts then on, nutrient density as far as signaling any of those pathways? So, the mTOR pathway is known to be, triggered by amino acids, but how about, nutrient density? I think of it, again, look at the ancestral template as like during fasting periods of famine periods, there were no nutrients coming in. And then we had these other periods of feasting. And I think that's, how our bodies are designed to optimally function. And fortunately, we live in a world of feasting constantly, and most of that feasting is on nutrient poor food. So what are your thoughts about how nutrient density plays into this, brain health and longevity piece?
I think it does in a lot of ways. I mean, one of the ways, again, kind of comes back to the microbiome, which we talked about last time, and is certainly another area that I love to focus on. And so nutrient density includes, in sort of my definition, I mean, there's sort of the vitamin and mineral aspect to that, but there's also the phytonutrients. And I think the phytonutrients in particular are really interesting because some of those same phytonutrients that we've talked about before that interact with the microbiome, and in a lot of cases require the microbiome to convert them into their bioactive form. Some of those same phytonutrients have been shown to trigger these pathways, these longevity pathways. So that could be one way. And there's kind of this, it's really sort of an open question still as to how exactly do phytonutrients improve health. So we know that they're anti-inflammatory. We know that they're antioxidant in a lot of cases. They also tend to improve the balance between good and bad microbes in the microbiome. But there's also this aspect to them that they're these compounds from plants that are made for defense, right? So they're made to defend against like insects and even microbes, et cetera, that are attacking the plants. And so they're defense mechanisms, so they're meant to be kind of poisonous to these organisms. So the idea is that our liver sees them potentially as potential poisons, and so it upregulates these stress resistance pathways. So
they're the most natural bioactive homeopathic medicine, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. That's that exact concept, that a low dose of something that might be toxic at a high dose is actually good for us because it stimulates our defense systems. So it's probably all of the above, because there's plenty of evidence that they have, and inflammation is a major aspect of aging. And certainly when it comes to the brain, neuroinflammation is now thought to be a major aspect of aging and age-related disease. And there's a really interesting paper that came out recently linking, they didn't really know where this sort of increase in inflammation with age came from. There's sort of all these ideas about, all this damage that's happening with aging is somehow triggering inflammation, which I think is partly true. But that didn't really explain the whole picture. And a study just came out this year showing that imbalances in the microbiome, i.e. dysbiosis, we have more of these pro-inflammatory microbes and fewer of the anti-inflammatory microbes. That increases with age. And so basically one of the sources of this sort of brain inflammation as we get older appears to be the gut. And so again, it kind of comes back to, how do we address that? And that's why you talked about nutrient density, and I'm kind of focused on the phytonutrient piece, because one of the key ways to balance the microbiome is through these phytonutrients, because it's study after study has shown that in general, they reduce those pro-inflammatory bacteria and they increase the anti-inflammatory bacteria.
Well, and it's a really interesting, like it's bringing up for me thought of like, okay, so a little bit of it was good. And if we think about our ancestors, the way that they ate those phytonutrients were going to be in, small amounts. It wasn't like wild blueberries grew so abundantly that they could, eat pounds of them every day, right? It was going to be little concentrated bits of them. And so along the lines of more is not always better is what's coming up for me right now. And that eating massive amounts and blenderizing as much blueberries and kale and everything as you can choke down, if it's truly part of it is a little bit of a poison to our body, more is not going to be better.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing that I learned, so I took as part of my master's training, we had a bioactive compounds class, and it was really interesting because we learned about some of the mechanism, but also a lot of the class was like, there's a bunch of this that we don't even know yet. Like it's kind of a new opening, a field that's evolving. Here's what we know about these things, but we don't know everything even close to it. One of the things that really stood out to me was the phytochemicals, the bioactive compounds in plants tend to be concentrated in the skin of them. And then, so the smaller something is, so let's take blueberries, for example, like wild blueberries are very tiny little things, whereas the commercial ones we can get are like, almost this big around now. And so per weight, the really small, dense ones are going to have a higher concentration of those bioactive compounds than the big ones. And so we see everything commercialized and grown, like strawberries now are like this big, and then the wild strawberries are this big. And so we're actually diluting the amount of those beneficial, compounds that we can even get.
You bring up a really important point, because, we sort of, we can only do what we can do within our sort of modern society. And it's difficult for most people to go out and just forage for their own wild food. But, when you think about, we think of fruits and vegetables as being, the most important aspects of a healthy diet. And we have, what's available in the grocery stores. Organic and wild sources are becoming more common. Like you can get wild blueberries to some extent now, for example. But we have to keep in mind that, of course, those are the two main changes really that have been, there's more than that, of course, including pesticides and things like that. But the sort of lower density of nutrients over time, as you mentioned, is an important aspect, as well as lower variety.
Mm.
Some of the estimates of certain hunter-gatherer societies, and it depends on what part of the world they lived in, but some of them they estimate accessed up to 150 to 200 different species of plants on an annual basis, versus the typical person maybe eats 20, maximum 30 different fruits and vegetables on a regular basis. So our diversity is really, really reduced,
Oh, that's
even
so
with these
true.
healthy foods.
Yeah, that's so true. Because here in the Northwest where I live, back when I was in school, there were several herbal medicine classes that I took, and one of them was, teaching us how to identify edible plants in the wild. And specific summer going hiking, and I found, I can't even remember now, but there were like 8 different species of edible berries that I'd never even really heard of, like different kinds of raspberries and things like that, for example. And I was just so surprised that there were so many of those right here in my backyard that you're never going to see in the grocery store. It's so true.
Right. Yeah, we have a few people locally in the Denver area that do like foraging type classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been meaning to sign up for one of those. I just haven't had a chance yet, but I'd love to get out there because I do a lot of hiking. And while I'm out, I'm passing by all these plants and thinking that some of them may be edible and I could be increasing my diversity right now.
Yeah.
Although some of them might be poisonous, so I want to know what I'm doing first.
Yeah, because some of the ones that look the most delicious are poisonous. The reason they look so good is they're the plant's own defense mechanism. But so then talk to us about the microbiome. How does the gut talk to the brain? Like, how does the brain even know what's going on down there?
That's a great question. Yeah. So we don't know all the different ways yet, but the key pathways that have been so far identified are number one, of course, there's the presence of the nervous system in the gut itself. So we have something called the enteric nervous system, which is composed of something like 100 to 200 billion different nerve cells just in the gut. So that's why it's oftentimes called the second brain. It's the largest concentration of neurons in any organ outside of the central nervous system. So we know that means that, obviously the gut is important in terms of this two-way interaction of controlling what's going on in the gut and then sensing what's going on in the gut and relaying that information back to the brain. And so the enteric nervous system is largely self-contained, and studies have been done that even if you disconnect it, in lab animals of course, from the central nervous system, which is mostly through the vagus nerve, that basically it can still kind of function on its own in terms of just general basic function. It can still move food through, etc. Whereas the vagus nerve has this modulatory, regulatory effect. So it's adding additional capacity to sense what's going on, especially in the upper GI tract. So like your stomach, for example, and upper intestine are more sort of sensing what's going on with the vagus nerve, as well as the signals coming down from the brain controlling more what's going on in the upper GI tract. And so when you hear about people saying, you really need to relax while you're eating, you need to chew your food while you're eating, those are all because our nervous system is registering what's going on and preparing for digestion. And so we need to have sort of this connection between the brain and nervous system for sensing what's going on in the gut, including with the microbiome, as well as controlling digestion. And so the microbiome depends heavily on that whole digestive process. Because it's, if we're not digesting our food, then the microbiome is getting all these food components that it wouldn't normally get that should have been digested higher up, and that's going to cause dysbiosis. So the nervous system is really one key component of that two-way interaction. Another one is the immune system. And so we know that there's a relatively new field called either neuroimmunology or psychoneuroimmunology, where they're finding that the nervous system and the immune system communicate heavily with each other to kind of crosstalk and sort of inform each other what's going on. And so we know we have 70% of our immune system in the gut as well. So there's this huge presence of nerves and this huge presence of immune cells. And so if we are eating an inflammatory food or we have inflammatory bacteria, or a pathogen present, that's going to start to create inflammation. And then those immune cells are sending out signals that then either go into the bloodstream and up to the brain to signal the brain directly, or they locally, those nerves that are in the stomach, in the digestive tract, can sense those molecules, usually called cytokines, and basically then that can relay the information back up to the brain. And so there's something called sickness behavior. It's sort of this scientifically defined phenomena that's mostly used in animal studies, but basically there's inflammation in the gut induced experimentally from a pathogen or from some sort of chemical or something, that basically the animal will exhibit typical sickness behavior. They'll stop moving. They'll exhibit signs of kind of depression. They won't be interested in the things they're normally interested in. They obviously probably don't feel good. And that's all mediated largely by the vagus nerve that's picking up this inflammation signal in the gut and relaying it to the brain.
That's really, really interesting, because it kind of pieces together, like, after my car accident and, whatever was going on in my brain, whether it was, a traumatic brain injury or the inflammation that, happened after that whole thing, I started to experience gastroparesis, which, for people that don't know what that is like I would eat and things would just sit in my stomach all day for hours, and I would still be hungry, but nothing was moving along in the rest of the GI. So it just wouldn't digest. And, as soon as I started a ketogenic diet, like, that dramatically dropped my inflammation down.
Wow.
But probably it was also like changing the foods that were, getting into my gut as well. So that can explain a lot. I know that, being in ketosis is very anti-inflammatory, but what you're explaining as well, it's like in my gut, there was a lot less inflammation signaling happening as well, based on the change of the foods that I was eating too.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we do see, so gastroparesis is commonly seen in people with type 2 diabetes as well. And this, can explain, this hyperinflammation state in their body is sending those signals to slow down. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? It's like, this food isn't good for us. Like, slow down the digestion. Don't give me more of this.
Yeah, and also that the inflammatory response is energy intensive. And so, it's a way for our body to sort of shift, because our brains are smart. And one of the main functions of our brain is to sort of manage how we allocate our energy. Because historically, evolutionary energy was always very precious because food was hard to get. And so if you have to deal with an infection or something like that, you want to make sure that the person or the animal is not expending a lot of energy running around, doing things like that, that you want to conserve that energy so the immune system can do its job. That's kind of the thought, I think, behind some of that. And then there was actually a couple other the routes that I wanted to mention as far as communication between the gut and the brain. So we know that microbes also produce products. So when they're converting our food into whatever it is that they produce, one of the main set of products that they produce is something called short-chain fatty acids. And we know that basically those have a lot of different effects. There's three main ones. Some of them are just local, like the colon cells use one of the short-chain fatty acids for its main energy source. But then some of these actually get transferred into the bloodstream, can have effects systemically, including the brain. And short-chain fatty acids have been shown to actually be able to cross the blood-brain barrier and then have a pretty significant effect on the brain, including the immune cells that are in the brain, and also the glia, which are kind of immune cells, microglia. And we know that short-chain fatty acids have an effect on that and help sort of reduce their inflammatory potential. So that's another way. And there's a number of other different types of products that microbes produce, and a lot of them haven't even been characterized yet. Some of the more potentially harmful ones are thought to contribute to certain conditions and diseases, such as autism. And so there's good molecules that are produced by the beneficial bacteria, and there's potentially some harmful ones that can also have detrimental effects in the brain. So that's a kind of a third route in terms of products that they produce. And there's a few other kind of complicated pathways as well. They trigger these hormones in the gut which are produced by the endocrine cells in the gut, and those can influence like our hunger response. They can influence whether or not we feel full after a meal. So they play a lot of different roles in terms of that communication between the brain and the gut.
And how does our microbiome influence our metabolism? So I know that, a lot of the ladies that I work with, they're super carb sensitive, and, even going up to 30 grams of carbs per day is going to, kick them out of ketosis. And part of that might be or likely is their degree of insulin resistance. But I can imagine that, the gut biome is playing a part in that as well. So how does our gut biome influence our metabolism and our ability to produce ketones?
So that's kind of an ongoing area of research, and a lot of it hasn't been really well worked out yet, but there is some intriguing research so far. And so those short chain fatty acids that I mentioned, one of the ways that they influence metabolism is sort of through that influencing hunger versus satiety in the brain. So that's considered one of the main ones, but they also act as signaling molecules. So there's these receptors on a variety of different cell types, including adipose tissue, including skeletal muscle tissue, and even in the brain, that can respond to short chain fatty acids and other products from the microbes. And the sort of interplay there is pretty complex, and I'm not sure I even have a full grasp on that yet, but certainly studies have been shown that these short chain fatty acids influence insulin sensitivity, as well as the sort of balance between fat synthesis and fat breakdown. And for the most part, they have beneficial effects, especially butyrate seems to have a pretty beneficial effect. There's a little bit of contradictory information out there suggesting that one of the other short-chain fatty acids, called acetate, may actually be something that stimulates obesity, that's involved in obesity. That research is a bit controversial because there are studies that show it has the opposite effect. So it's not really clear. A lot of this is still being worked out. And I think it's going to depend on, that's where you get into the details of an individual's microbiome. So maybe you have a microbiome that's producing more butyrate than these other short-chain fatty acids, and someone else has a microbiome that's producing more acetate, and that would have a differential influence potentially on your metabolism. So that's one route. The other route that's also being explored and pretty complex is through something called bile acids. So bile acids are normally, of course, produced in the liver and then secreted from the gallbladder, when you basically have a meal that contains fat. So the idea that bile acids, we were sort of taught in anatomy and physiology class that bile acids, pretty much all they did was help sort of break down the fat, help make it accessible for our enzymes. And that was kind of it.
The soap for the fat.
Yeah, exactly. Detergent-like activity. Now they're finding that they have a really important role. And so it turns out that there's receptors even in the intestine that detect bile acids and affect basically sort of the same things that short-chain fatty acids affect. So they can affect insulin sensitivity and usage of glucose, as well as that balance between fat synthesis and breakdown. And so it turns out that we don't know all the ins and outs yet, but bacteria actually can affect the bile acids. So they take the bile acids that are released into the gastrointestinal tract, and they can basically break them down and modify them. And those are called secondary bile acids. And then those have a whole other set of effects on metabolism. So that's to me is really, it comes back to, we're linking it to the ketogenic diet, which is high fat. Yeah. You presume that under a higher fat diet, that we're going to be secreting more bile acids in general to deal with that higher fat load. And that's going to potentially change the composition of the microbiome, because the ones that do well on, basically breaking down those products are going to potentially flourish, and that's going to affect the balance of the metabolism. So for the most part, when you have these beneficial bacteria that are producing sort of the normal amounts of these secondary bile acids, producing normal amounts of short-chain fatty acids, that's thought to be conducive with overall metabolic health.
Hmm.
And then when you get out of balance with the microbiome, that's not necessarily a major cause. That really hasn't been established yet, whether they're a major cause of like obesity and things like that, but they certainly contribute and influence that.
Oh, that's really interesting too. So another mechanism of why this low-fat diet craze that we've gone through the last 40 or 50 years is made us fatter, sicker than we would have otherwise thought from what we were told. Why fat was bad.
Yeah, because the idea is then we're probably not secreting as much bile, and we're not getting as much of that bile acid signaling pathway for normal metabolism. And so that's likely contributed to, at least in my opinion, based on what I've read in the research, that's likely contributing to that.
Yeah. Well, let's touch on a hot topic right now in relation to what we were just talking about is coconut oil going to kill us all and give us a heart attack? Is fat bad, saturated fat bad? And
yeah, I think it's a really fascinating topic. And of course, we've seen so many posts and social media addressing that recently and kind of debunking some of what the American Heart Association was putting out. Was it the AHA or AMA? I can't remember.
The AHA, yeah.
Okay, Heart Association.
Yeah.
So it's I like to try to give simple answers where I can, but since I'm translating the research, research is what it is, and it's not always totally straightforward. So I'll kind of give you the pros and cons side in terms of what's known out there. So we do know, I'll start with the negative side, get that out of the way, the bad news. We do know that in general, mostly from animal studies, that high-fat diets, and if you read these papers, they'll say high-fat diet, does something bad. High-fat diet does something bad. The devil's in the details. Because what does that mean, high-fat diet? What's the context? But basically, they've shown in these studies that what happens is that extra fat results in, so I mentioned these pro-inflammatory bacteria when we have dysbiosis. They have a molecule as part of their outer cell wall of the cell called LPS. It stands for lipopolysaccharide, but LPS is a better way to remember it. That's really strongly inflammatory. If that gets into your system, for example, if you have leaky gut or intestinal permeability, that can stimulate a pretty strong inflammatory response. And so we know that from these studies that extra saturated fat basically results in higher levels of inflammation, as well as letting in more of this pro-inflammatory LPS molecule. So it seems clear from those studies, mostly in mice, that in that context, it does increase inflammation quite a bit.
But you have to then give the asterisk and explain what high-fat diet is in research terms.
Right. So there's really two main concerns there. One is that mice are not people, right? The other one is when you look at the diet, and I did this at one point, I was looking up to see what specifically they were using in these diets, and it's a highly processed diet.
And it's not low carb. It's a high-fat, high-carb diet.
Right. It's in the context of high carbs as well. So I have yet to see a study where they've kind of done that same sort of approach in the context of a low-carb diet to see if that still is pro-inflammatory. Because we know that ketogenic diets have these anti-inflammatory effects. So I think context really makes a big difference. And so to me, that research...
What I found, that's what I found looking into the research myself, was that I learned that high-fat diet is code for standard American diet.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It's not, when they mean low-carb ketogenic diet, they're going to call it that specifically. So that gets muddled where people say, oh, high-fat diet, that's the same as a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet, but it's not.
Right. And the other thing I would say is a lot of studies have shown that to some extent, regardless of the diet, so there's all these studies looking at kind of macronutrient ratios. Protein also, there's kind of phenomena with the microbiome that this has been shown in people too, but particularly in lab animals, if they have too much protein or they can't break down the protein for some reason, they can generate, the microbiome will actually metabolize these amino acids and produce potentially harmful byproducts. And so it's kind of the same idea with fat, that if there's too much fat, basically that lets in this pro-inflammatory molecule from the microbiome, and that contributes to inflammation. But they've shown, particularly with regard to the protein situation, that as long as the diet contains enough fiber and phytonutrients, i.e. plant foods, that completely mitigates that effect. So again, to me, it's about context, that somebody who does a ketogenic diet but doesn't take in enough sort of fiber and phytonutrients as part of their low-carb plant intake probably is at higher risk for some of these inflammatory consequences versus someone who makes sure they're careful about getting enough, high-quality plant foods that are low in carbs and starch. So again, I think the context really makes a big difference.
You mentioned a couple of times about, protein, its connection with longevity, but then also too much of it can cause, some bad byproducts of digestion in the from the microbiome. Do you have a sense of, how much that is? I'm sure that research isn't really definitive, but is it, 2 grams per kilogram, 4 grams per kilogram, or 1.5? Do you have any sense of where that line is of too much protein?
Really only in terms of percent of overall calories. And again, this is mostly from animal studies, so you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. But basically, the idea is that if the protein intake is over about, it's really going to depend a lot on other factors, and particularly how well you break down protein. If you're breaking down protein really well and your digestion is good, then relatively little is going to get into the colon where the microbiome can act on that. So from that sort of protein fermentation standpoint, the idea is that if you keep protein kind of somewhere around 15 to 20% of the diet, then you're probably in an okay range, unless you don't digest protein well. You can still get an excess protein in your colon from not having good stomach acid, etc. So again, there's sort of some context there. In terms of the longevity aspect, it's kind of roughly around the same point, but maybe down to about 10%. But there's a pretty narrow lower limit there, because if you go past a certain point, then there's a fairly significant detrimental effect. And also studies suggest that when you look at the lifespan, that basically the low protein approach for longevity generally sort of applies up until about age 65. And so there's some research that's been done with people suggesting that over 65, they benefit from a little bit higher levels of protein.
And I would, knowing what I know about how digestion changes as we age, especially, the stomach environment, that makes sense. Probably my guess of that would be that just because as we get older, we can't digest protein as well. So you need more of it to get more out of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that could be the main reason behind that. Also because, protein tends to be sort of stimulating the anabolic processes. And as we get older, those are just sort of, our body slows down, we're not repairing things as well. So anything we can do to kind of help that sort of repair process, maintenance process, even if it means taking in somewhat higher protein, which, in other contexts would be pro-longevity, in that context, it's probably protective.
Yeah. Well, Tom, once again, our time has flown by, but let's just wrap this up. And, any other, closing thoughts or any other tips or pointers that you have for people watching?
Well, we've covered a lot of territory here. I had a few sort of like detailed specific things that we could dive into. I had a few notes here. Let me just look and see if there's anything else that pops out
actually,
at me.
we got a little detracted. We talked about the negative parts of fat and coconut oil, but we didn't get to cover the good parts of it. Yeah,
that's true.
We should close that out.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we kind of touched on it just a little bit in terms of bile acids. So we know we need, it's not really clear yet from the research, what's sort of the optimal level. But you mentioned low fat diets from the past, we're not going to be getting enough bile acid release in those circumstances. And so we need to have a certain amount to stimulate normal bile acid production. So we get normal bile acid signaling. But But then there's, mostly when you look at the ketogenic diet, which is high fat, and we need to, whether it's ketogenic diet or fasting or these other routes to get into ketogenesis and produce these ketones, with the ketogenic diet being a great option. We know from a lot of research that these ketones have all kinds of beneficial effects, particularly beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is anti-inflammatory and also helps promote brain function. So, again, I think kind of in the big picture, we know the body's complex. We know that there's lots of different routes for these food components to go through. And say, just theoretically that fat affects 100 different things. I'm sure it's more than that. And that with a particular higher fat diet, maybe 30 of them that are considered kind of negative, are affected. But then you have 70 out of the 100 that are positive that are affected in your ketogenic diet. So the balance is going to be positive. Oftentimes researchers is looking at these little narrow windows and you're only looking at a small slice of the picture. So that's kind of my take on a lot of these things, is when you have to really go back and look at the bulk of the research to see, kind of get that bigger picture. That's why, you always hear this caution about taking one particular study too seriously, because they're really only looking at one thing, or a very small subset of things. And my take on the research is that there's so much that's come out about the benefits of the ketogenic diet, particularly in regard to these specific effects of the ketones that are they're anti-inflammatory, etc. I think that in the balance, as long as the diet is clean, as long as you have plenty of fiber and plant food to get those phytonutrients, as long as you're keeping your protein within a certain level, and you're of course using clean, healthy fats. Maybe that's something we'll talk about in the future, like what exactly is a good fat. I think they're just looking in a narrow window and they're interpreting a lot of animal data that's not relevant to the typical context of, our diets.
Well, yeah, because most animals are herbivores anyways. They don't tend to have a high-fat diet or a high-protein diet anyways.
Exactly. Yeah, I can't imagine a mouse running around out in the field coming across a trove of coconut oil. It's like it's not...
Yeah. Yeah, or
exactly.
eating rabid mice eating other squirrels or something like that.
Yeah. Right. So, it's we don't have to take those kind of things with a grain of salt. And I do appreciate some of the people that have been out there trying to balance that debate, and help people realize we can't just go off a few studies. We can't over extrapolate from animal studies. You got to look at the big picture.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I once again appreciate you being here and appreciate your time. And I don't remember how you answered this question last time, so I'm going to ask you again the same way we close out as, meteors coming at us today. It's your last day on this planet. What are you going to enjoy as your last meal?
I think I'm going to change it because I actually remember what I said last time, which was pizza and ice cream.
Okay.
Since I'm gluten-free, dairy-free, and have been for 7 years, and I'm pretty strict, I haven't had either of those. But it's summertime, and there's all this fresh produce out there, and I really love fresh produce in the summer. And one of my all-time favorite things in the summer is, I love a lot of the fresh produce, but I really like raspberries.
Okay.
For some reason. I don't know why, but ever since I was a kid, I just love raspberries. So I'll pick something different this time. And raspberries.
Just a bucket of raspberries.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Well, I love raspberries too. Actually, we got some in the fridge. I was just eating some last night. So,
do they grow locally where you're at?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember. The box does say they're from Washington.
Okay.
Probably at this time of the year, they're coming from someplace east where they've had a lot more heat and sun. But they will be like probably in August, September here, right where I'm at. If people have them in their yard or wherever else, they will be ripe and grow. They do grow here. So.
Yeah, I remember when I lived in Seattle that I would go down to the park near me, and there was all the wild, I guess they're blackberries or Marion berries.
Blackberries, yeah.
Blackberries, okay.
Yeah,
just go down with a container and pick fresh blackberries in the
Oh
summertime.
my gosh, those are absolutely crazy here. Like every side road area that hasn't been, groomed as, a park or something like that, they're just a massive abundance. You can go pick gallons of them, and they're the big giant Himalayan ones. And it's funny to me because you can still, in the stores around here through the summer, they'll sell half a pint for like $6. And people will buy them, and I'm like, you could just stop on your way home and pick like 10 times that much for, in 10 minutes or something. But people,
and they taste better too.
Yeah, people still are paying $6 for a half pint of blackberries, and where are they even coming from? Like, yeah. All right.
Cool.
Well,
thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Tom, for everything, and I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation even more. And
great, I'd love to.
I'll be meeting you at the Ancestral Health Symposium. This could be in Seattle in September, so looking forward to that as well. And
be coming up fast.
Yeah. So we'll put your contact info here if you want to connect with Tom. Microbiomemastery.com is his website, and we'll link that below in the show notes. And so give us a thumbs up if you like this, subscribe if you want to see more of these videos, and we'll see you next time. Bye.